This is where people usually go wrong. They believe that the art of persuasion is a mystical gift bestowed upon a lucky few at birth. A magical silver tongue that can talk anyone into anything. They imagine charismatic individuals effortlessly weaving spells of words, relying on gut instinct and pure charm to close deals. But the truth found in the roaring, chaotic heart of Wall Street tells a fundamentally different story. In the high-stakes, adrenaline-fueled boiler rooms where fortunes were forged in mere minutes, instinct was never enough. Relying on charm was a gamble. And gambling was for the amateurs. The real masters of the game, the ones who consistently turned raw, unpolished recruits into millionaires, did not rely on magic. They relied on a system. They understood that every conversation, every negotiation, and every attempt to influence another human being is not a meandering stroll through a park, but a highly structured, scientifically predictable journey. This journey has a distinct beginning, a definite end, and invisible boundaries that must never be crossed. The narrative unfolds not in quiet, sterile classrooms, but amidst the deafening roar of the Stratton Oakmont bullpen. Picture a sea of hungry, desperate young men and women, many with no formal education, no pedigree, and no inherent understanding of high finance. They walked through those doors with nothing but a burning desire to change their circumstances. And yet, within weeks, these exact individuals were dominating conversations with the wealthiest, most sophisticated executives in the country. They were closing deals worth millions over the phone, wielding an invisible power that seemed almost hypnotic. This transformation was not a miracle, it was the result of the straight line. The concept is brutally simple yet infinitely complex in its execution. Imagine a straight line drawn on a whiteboard. At the far left is the opening of the sale, the very first syllable uttered. At the far right is the close, the moment the prospect agrees and the transaction is complete. Every single word, every tonal shift, every calculated pause must be designed to move the prospect down that exact line. There is no room for aimless chatting, no space for discussing the weather or building false rapport through meaningless banter. The moment the conversation drifts away from the line, crossing the boundaries into irrelevant territory, control is lost. The master persuader knows exactly how to politely but firmly pull the prospect back to the line, maintaining absolute authority over the direction of the dialogue. This brings forth a profound lesson about human interaction. True rapport is not built by pretending to be someone's best friend. True rapport is built by demonstrating that you are an expert who can help them achieve their goals or solve their pain. People do not buy from you because they like your sports analogies, they buy because they believe you hold the key to their desired outcome. The psychology of this process begins before the prospect even has a chance to consciously process what is happening. It happens in the first 4 seconds. Evolution has hardwired the human brain to make lightning-fast judgments about every new person it encounters. In the ancient past, this rapid cognition was necessary for survival, deciding in an instant if a stranger was a friend or a deadly foe. Today, that same primal instinct dictates the outcome of every pitch, every interview, and every sales call. Within those initial 4 seconds, the voice on the other end of the line must establish 3 absolute truths. First, they must sound sharp as a tack. This means demonstrating mental agility, speed, and a quick intellect. The prospect must instantly subconsciously register that they are dealing with someone who is bright and not to be trifled with. Second, they must be enthusiastic as hell. This is not the fake, overwhelming cheerfulness of a television infomercial, but a deep, simmering passion bubbling just beneath the surface. It is a contagious energy that suggests the persuader has discovered something truly incredible and can barely contain their excitement to share it. Third, they must present themselves as a figure of authority, an absolute expert in their field. People are conditioned from birth to respect and defer to authority figures, parents, teachers, doctors, and experts. When a voice projects unwavering authority, the listener's defenses naturally lower, and they open themselves up to being led. Failing to establish these 3 pillars in the first 4 seconds means the battle is lost before the first volley is even fired. The prospect's brain will immediately categorize the speaker as a waste of time, a nuisance, or an amateur, and an invisible wall of resistance will slam down. Overcoming that wall later in the conversation is virtually impossible. But when the 4-second rule is mastered, something miraculous happens. The prospect relinquishes control. They willingly step onto the straight line, ready to be guided toward the logical and emotional conclusion of the pitch. This leads to the core engine of the system, the transfer of emotion. Persuasion, stripped of all its complex mechanics, is simply the transfer of absolute certainty from the persuader to the prospect. To achieve this transfer, the persuader must first possess a level of certainty that is unshakable. They must believe, in their very bones, that the product or idea they are presenting is the absolute best solution available. But certainty is not a monolithic concept. It is divided into two distinct realms, logical certainty and emotional certainty. The narrative often highlights the tragic flaw of the novice who appeals only to logic. They bombard the prospect with facts, figures, statistics, and rational arguments. They build a watertight case that makes perfect intellectual sense. Yet, the prospect still hesitates. They say they need to think about it, or talk to their spouse, or review the numbers. The novice walks away baffled, unaware that human beings are fundamentally emotional creatures. We do not make decisions based solely on logic. We make decisions based on emotion. And then we desperately scramble to find logical justifications for the emotional choices we have already made. Therefore, the straight line demands a dual assault. The persuader must build an airtight logical case, satisfying the analytical brain, but they must simultaneously paint a vivid, irresistible picture of the future that ignites the emotional brain. They must make the prospect feel the relief, the joy, or the power that will come from taking action. They must also subtly agitate the prospect's current pain, making the status quo feel unbearable. This delicate dance between logic and emotion is choreographed entirely through tonality. The words spoken account for a mere fraction of the communication. The true power lies in how those words are delivered. The master of the straight line uses their voice like a finely tuned instrument. They use a whisper to create a sense of secrecy, making the prospect feel like they are being let in on an exclusive truth. They use a tone of absolute certainty to crush doubt. They use a tone of total sincerity, dropping their voice down into their chest, to convey deep empathy and understanding when discussing the prospect's pain points. As the journey down the line continues, the persuader must constantly monitor the prospect's level of certainty across three crucial domains, known in the roaring trading rooms as the 3 tens. On a scale from 1 to 10, the prospect must be at an absolute 10 in their belief in the product. They must view it as the ultimate solution to their problem, but the product is only the first pillar. The second 10 is their belief in the persuader themselves. Do they trust the person on the other end of the line? Do they believe this person cares about their well-being, or are they just looking for a commission? If there is any lingering doubt about the character or competence of the persuader, the deal will shatter. The third 10 is belief in the company that stands behind the product. A brilliant product sold by a trustworthy person will still fail if the prospect believes the underlying organization is corrupt or unreliable. The tension in the narrative builds as the persuader pushes closer to the close. Carefully managing these 3 tens, they are constantly testing the waters, throwing out trial closes to gauge the prospect's temperature. And inevitably, they hit a wall. Objections arise. I don't have the money. It's not a good time. I need to speak to my partner. The amateur hears these objections and either gives up or starts aggressively arguing, completely derailing the straight line. But the master understands that these initial objections are rarely the real issue. They are smokescreens, polite excuses used to mask a lack of certainty in one of the 3 tens. The true art of the system is revealed in the technique of looping. Instead of attacking the objection head-on, the persuader gracefully deflects it, acknowledges it without validating it, and loops back around to rebuild certainty. They tell a new story, present a new angle, and systematically elevate the prospect's certainty in the product, the persuader, and the company back toward a 10. This psychological maneuvering is intense, requiring supreme focus and emotional intelligence. The persuader must read the subtle hesitations in the prospect's voice, the pregnant pauses, the defensive sighs. They must push hard enough to break through the natural human resistance to change. but softly enough to avoid breaking rapport. It is a high-wire act where the safety net is nothing more than the persuader's absolute conviction in the value they are offering. As the loop tightening, the logical case becomes undeniable, and the emotional vision becomes irresistible. The prospect is backed into a corner of their own making. The pain of staying the same finally outweighs the fear of taking a risk. The invisible line has been walked from start to finish, culminating in the inevitable moment where the prospect says yes, not because they were bullied or coerced, but because the persuader masterfully aligned the prospect's internal desires with the irresistible logic of the pitch. The moment of agreement, that quiet, sudden utterance of assent from the prospect, was never viewed as the end of the magic within the chaotic walls of the brokerage firm. Rather, it was the ultimate validation of a reproducible, almost terrifyingly effective science. The true, earth-shattering power of this straight-line architecture was not its ability to make one inherently charismatic individual inexplicably wealthy, but its astonishing capacity to be endlessly duplicated. In the sprawling, frenetic bullpen of the firm, a room that smelled perpetually of stale coffee, expensive cologne, and raw adrenaline, this duplication was happening at an unprecedented, industrial scale. The young men and women walking tentatively through those heavy glass doors were not polished, pedigreed graduates of Ivy League business schools. They were often marginalized, forgotten youth, individuals who had stumbled or failed completely in traditional educational settings. They possessed absolutely no inherent financial literacy, no background in high-stakes corporate negotiations, and absolutely no safety net. They were raw, unshaped clay, desperate for direction, hungry for a taste of the promised American dream, and completely devoid of the sophisticated communication skills normally required to navigate Wall Street. Yet, within a matter of mere days of being submerged in the rhythmic, relentless, cult-like training of the straight line, these inexperienced, often unpolished recruits were undergoing a rapid and highly lucrative metamorphosis. They were handed a script, not as a mere suggestion or a rough outline, but as a sacred, immutable text. This script was the heavily guarded, distilled essence of thousands of successful and agonizingly failed interactions, a document mathematically optimized and rigorously tested to trigger highly specific, predictable psychological responses. It was fiercely drilled into their minds that it was never enough to simply read the words on the page. The words themselves were merely the lyrics to a much more complex song. The true, devastating mastery lay entirely in the melody, the precise, almost musical application of tonal shifts that bypassed the logical, highly guarded defenses of the wealthy, highly educated individuals on the other side of the telephone line. The recruits were rigorously trained to sound exactly like the senior executives and seasoned financial veterans their prospects were accustomed to dealing with, artificially borrowing years of authority and expertise through the sheer, calculated force of their vocal delivery alone. The creation of this foundational script was an agonizing, obsessive process of continuous trial and error, a rigorous linguistic engineering effort where every single syllable, every comma, and every deliberate pause was meticulously weighed for its exact emotional impact. A single, awkwardly misplaced word or a moment of genuine hesitation could instantly shatter the delicate, manufactured illusion of absolute authority. The sprawling narrative of the firm's unprecedented rise is inexorably linked to the perfection of these written words. The script served as a set of indestructible steel guardrails, keeping the young, wildly inexperienced brokers from veering off into the highly dangerous, unpredictable territory of unstructured, casual conversation, where the locus of control inevitably and swiftly slips away from the persuader and is handed directly to the prospect. It dictated with brutal precision exactly when to pause and let the silence hang heavily in the air, when to sigh with manufactured empathy, when to drop the volume of the voice to a conspiratorial, intimate whisper, and when to rise to a booming crescendo of absolute, unshakable certainty. This sophisticated vocal choreography was entirely designed to answer the silent, unasked questions constantly lingering in the back of the wary prospect's mind. When a 22-year-old broker dramatically lowered their voice, adopting a tone of profound, absolute sincerity and deep concern, they were not just communicating dry financial information, they were actively transmitting a powerful emotional state. They were silently, irresistibly whispering directly to the prospect's subconscious mind, desperately signaling that this was not a cold, transactional, everyday pitch, but an urgent, deeply personal, and highly lucrative intervention. The listener, often a seasoned, cynical business owner or a deeply wary investor who had been pitched 1,000 times before, would suddenly find their usual skepticism melting away, replaced by a strange, incredibly compelling urge to simply trust the disembodied voice echoing in their ear. This was the dark, unacknowledged art of tonal influence. It allowed a high school dropout sitting in a chaotic, screaming room on Long Island to mentally and emotionally dominate a 60-year-old millionaire sitting behind a massive desk in a mahogany-paneled office in Manhattan. The profound analytical lesson extracted from this intense, high-pressure environment is that human communication is fundamentally and inescapably visceral. The actual, factual content of the message accounts for a shockingly small percentage of the actual persuasion taking place. The overwhelming majority of the influence is carried directly by the emotional resonance and the carefully calibrated delivery of the speaker. The true persuader must become an actor of the highest possible caliber, perfectly matching their internal emotional state to the specific, required tonal pattern dictated by that exact millimeter on the straight line. However, the most exquisitely written, flawlessly delivered script in the world is utterly useless, a complete waste of breath, if it consistently falls upon the wrong ears, a critical, defining juncture in the straight-line journey, the harsh reality that permanently separates the struggling amateurs from the lethally effective closers, is the ruthless, deeply uncompromising process of qualification. The narrative naturally shifts from the artistry of the pitch to the frantic, desperate energy of the prospecting phase, where time is universally recognized as the ultimate, irreplaceable currency. The novice, untrained salesperson approaches every breathing human being as a potential target, tragically wasting countless hours desperately trying to convince, cajole, and manipulate individuals who either completely lack the actual financial resources to make a purchase or have absolutely no intrinsic, genuine need for the product being offered. They foolishly attempt to turn base lead into solid gold, engaging in exhausting, entirely futile battles against the insurmountable forces of reality. The master, deeply trained in the brutal, highly efficient mechanics of the boiler room, operates with a chillingly different, almost predatory mindset. They understand perfectly that their primary, overarching objective in the opening minutes of any interaction is not to sell anything at all, but to violently and efficiently filter the audience. They are constantly searching for a very specific, highly lucrative type of individual, the buyer in heat, the person actively searching for a solution, or at the very least, the buyer in power, the person with the authority and the capital to act when presented with the right opportunity. They deploy specific, highly targeted, sharply worded questions designed to rapidly and accurately assess both the prospect's financial capability and their actual, hidden level of desire. If the prospect inadvertently reveals themselves to be a mere curious observer, a time-wasting tire kicker who simply enjoys the attention of the conversation but has absolutely no intention or ability to ever make a real decision, the master mercilessly cuts the cord immediately. There is absolutely no lingering, no foolish hoping against hope, no wasted breath or false politeness. The straight line demands absolute, continuous forward momentum, and carrying the dead weight of an unqualified prospect is a mathematical and energetic impossibility. This brutal, highly structured filtering process highlights a profound, undeniable truth about human nature and the mechanics of commerce. You cannot force a human being to genuinely desire something they absolutely do not need. True persuasion is not the dark art of mental coercion, it is the highly efficient art of alignment. The skill of rapidly finding the exact individuals whose existing, burning desires perfectly match the specific solution being offered. Once the appropriate, fully qualified target is identified and locked securely into the system, the true, deeply invasive psychological warfare begins in earnest. The persuader must willingly delve into the deepest, most uncomfortable, and heavily guarded recesses of the prospect's reality. This introduces the fundamental, universally applicable concept of pain. Pain, in all its various forms, is the absolute, undeniable engine of human action. We are deeply, biologically wired to move away from sources of pain far more aggressively and desperately than we are motivated to move toward potential sources of pleasure. A prospect may express a mild, passing interest in improving their financial situation or upgrading their life, but a mild interest rarely, if ever, translates into immediate, decisive, financially significant action. The master persuader must actively locate the prospect's specific, hidden source of pain, perhaps a slowly failing business, a terrifying fear of a destitute retirement, or a quiet, agonizing sense of constantly falling behind their peers, and they must violently agitate it. They cannot afford to be polite, gentle, or accommodating. They must forcefully hold up a mirror and force the prospect to gaze directly at the agonizing, terrifying reality of their current trajectory. The entire narrative within the screaming boiler room was heavily built upon this raw, unapologetic emotional extraction. The young brokers were rigorously taught to ask probing, deeply unsettling questions that methodically stripped away the prospect's carefully constructed rationalizations and fully exposed the raw, throbbing nerve of their hidden anxiety. These were not pleasant, casual conversations. They were highly precise surgical procedures entirely designed to shatter the prospect's comfortable complacency. The lesson here is stark, cold, and unsentimental, until the pain of remaining in the current, stagnant situation becomes vastly more terrifying and unbearable than the perceived risk of taking a new, unknown action. The prospect will always remain paralyzed. The persuader is not maliciously inflicting pain. They are merely actively uncovering the pain that already secretly exists, forcing the prospect to finally acknowledge its debilitating, destructive presence in their life. This inevitable realization brings the narrative crashing into the most formidable, heavily fortified obstacle in the entire landscape of human persuasion, the action threshold. Every single human being carries within them an invisible, deeply ingrained psychological barrier that absolutely must be crossed before they can make a significant, binding decision. This massive barrier is carefully constructed over a lifetime from a collection of negative experiences, past, stinging failures, lingering, bitter regrets over bad purchases, and a fundamental, deep-seated evolutionary fear of the unknown. Some highly impulsive individuals have a remarkably low action threshold. They are the eager early adopters, the perpetual optimists who enthusiastically leap long before they ever bother to look. Others, however, possess an incredibly high, almost insurmountable action threshold. They are the eternal skeptics, the deeply cynical survivors who view absolutely every opportunity as a cleverly disguised, potentially lethal trap. When the master persuader finally encounters an individual with a high action threshold, they know with absolute certainty that logic alone will be instantly obliterated against this invisible, psychological wall. The prospect may completely, logically understand that the product is utterly flawless. They may trust the persuader implicitly and completely, and they may deeply believe in the integrity of the company. They may solidly possess all three critical tenets of certainty, and yet, they still inexplicably freeze at the final moment. The frustrating words, "I need to think about it," are almost never a genuine rejection of the pitch itself. They are the desperate, stalling cry of a high action threshold actively paralyzing the brain's decision-making process. To finally breach this ultimate, heavily defended fortress, the persuader must deploy a highly sophisticated, two-pronged emotional and logical assault. First, they must paint an incredibly vivid, absolutely irresistible, cinematic picture of the future. A scenario so impossibly bright and compelling that it actively, magnetically pulls the prospect forward. They must make the prospect viscerally feel the intense relief, the joy, and the power of having their deepest problem permanently solved. Second, they must dramatically and instantly lower the perceived risk of moving forward. They confidently offer ironclad guarantees. They heavily utilize soothing, carefully constructed language patterns that calm the anxious, firing brain, and they expertly frame the impending decision not as a massive, dangerous, terrifying leap into the dark void, but as a tiny, highly logical, easily reversible step. They seamlessly take the massive, crushing burden of the decision completely off the anxious prospect's weary shoulders and place it squarely, confidently upon their own, definitively clearing the path for the inevitable close. The silence that follows the final, definitive presentation of the solution is arguably the most terrifying and intensely powerful moment in the entire architecture of the sale. It is a suffocating, heavy void, an agonizingly protracted pause where the absolute laws of human nature dictate that the first person to speak unequivocally loses the power dynamic. The master of the straight line has relentlessly driven the prospect down the meticulously paved road, artfully escalating the logical certainty, masterfully amplifying the emotional desire, and violently lowering the perceived risk until there is absolutely nowhere left for the anxious mind to run or hide. And then, the persuader simply stops talking. They ask the closing question, a perfectly calibrated, entirely non-threatening inquiry designed to seamlessly initiate the transaction, and then they lock their jaw, utterly refusing to rescue the prospect from the excruciating, heavy pressure of the quiet moment. In the roaring, chaotic environment of the Long Island boiler room, this discipline of silence was drilled into the young recruits with the ferocity of military combat training. They were taught that jumping in to fill the dead air, even with a seemingly harmless, polite clarification or an anxious, placating murmur, would instantly shatter the immense psychological tension that had been so painstakingly, aggressively built over the past 45 minutes. The prospect, sitting in their quiet office hundreds of miles away, is suddenly left entirely alone with their thoughts, trapped perfectly between the agonizing, unbearable pain of their current, stagnant reality and the dazzling, beautifully painted, entirely irresistible vision of the future the persuader has just expertly hung in their mind. The silence forces the prospect's internal dialogue into overdrive, frantically weighing the 3 tens, desperately searching for any lingering, logical loophole or hidden, terrifying trap. But if the system has been executed flawlessly, if the looping has successfully dismantled every single underlying objection and the tonal delivery has established unshakable, absolute trust, the prospect finds nothing but smooth, frictionless inevitability. The sheer, overwhelming pressure of the silence eventually compels them to speak, and because the path backward is heavily blocked by their own newly awakened desires, the only possible words they can utter are words of absolute, total surrender. The agonizingly quiet moment shatters. The prospect softly breathes their agreement, and the heavy, intoxicating rush of victory instantly floods the veins of the persuader. Yet, it is precisely at this glorious, triumphant apex of total psychological dominance that the narrative takes a profoundly dark, deeply disturbing, and ultimately catastrophic turn. The sheer, terrifying power of this tightly engineered system, a system capable of entirely bypassing rational defenses and directly manipulating human emotion, carries within it an incredibly dangerous, highly intoxicating potential for catastrophic abuse. The tragic, spectacular downfall of the Stratton-Oakmont Empire was not caused by a sudden, catastrophic failure of the straight-line methodology. It was caused by the total, arrogant abandonment of fundamental human ethics. The young, incredibly wealthy brokers, utterly intoxicated by their newfound ability to effectively print money on demand through the sheer force of their vocal cords, began to blindly ignore the critical, absolute distinction between selling and lying. The system was originally designed to persuade a hesitant but fundamentally qualified buyer to take action on a genuinely beneficial opportunity, actively helping them overcome their own destructive, paralyzing fears. However, in the dark, frenzied, utterly corrupted heart of the boiler room, the system was aggressively, maliciously weaponized. The crucial, essential step of qualification was entirely discarded, replaced by a sociopathic, terrifying willingness to violently force highly volatile, inherently worthless financial instruments down the throats of desperately vulnerable, entirely unsuitable individuals. The beautiful, delicate art of alignment was violently replaced by the brutal, unforgiving science of pure, unadulterated exploitation. The brokers used the exact same masterful tonalities, the exact same perfectly structured loops, and the exact same excruciatingly powerful silence, not to guide the prospect toward a genuinely better future, but to deliberately, systematically march them directly off a financial cliff. The profound, deeply unsettling lesson here is that the mechanics of extreme persuasion are entirely, fundamentally amoral. The script does not possess a conscience. The tonality does not care about the underlying truth of the words being spoken. The straight line is merely a spectacularly powerful, highly efficient psychological tool, a devastatingly sharp linguistic scalpel that can just as easily be used to perform life-saving, miraculous surgery as it can be used to commit a horrific, bloody murder. The ultimate, catastrophic destruction of the firm and the subsequent, highly publicized imprisonment of its architect serve as a permanent, glaring, heavily neon-lit warning to anyone who seeks to master the dark, incredibly potent arts of human influence. When the persuader actively chooses to cross the sacred, invisible line into the dark realm of manipulation, when they deliberately manufacture false pain, deliberately construct completely fabricated visions of a non-existent future, and deliberately obscure massive, catastrophic risks, they initiate a highly destructive, irreversible karmic chain reaction. The immediate, short-term financial gains may be absolutely staggering, but the massive, underlying foundation is entirely built on rapidly shifting, deeply unstable sand. The prospect eventually, inevitably discovers the brutal, agonizing truth. The absolute certainty they were so masterfully sold is violently shattered, completely replaced by a burning, furious resentment and a deep, agonizing sense of total betrayal. The persuader, in their desperate, highly arrogant quest for absolute control, completely destroys the single most valuable, totally irreplaceable asset in any form of human exchange: genuine, lasting, unshakable trust. This spectacular, heavily scrutinized implosion clearly demonstrates that while the straight line can successfully force an immediate, highly lucrative transaction, it absolutely cannot sustain a deeply meaningful, long-term relationship built on a foundation of deceit. The entire, massive empire eventually collapsed under the crushing, unimaginable weight of its own spectacular lies, proving definitively that unethical persuasion is not a sustainable, viable business strategy. It is merely a rapidly burning, highly destructive fuse attached to a massive, inevitable psychological and financial bomb. Emerging from the heavy, suffocating ashes of this spectacular destruction, the narrative deeply transforms, actively stripping away the malicious, destructive intent to clearly reveal the pure, highly valuable, and incredibly necessary core of the system. In the modern, highly interconnected era, the absolute necessity for this profound level of structured, deeply engaging communication has never been more critically, intensely apparent. The modern landscape is no longer limited to high-pressure, one-on-one telephone calls. It is defined by the massive, incredibly difficult challenge of broadcasting a highly complex message to a massive, easily distracted, deeply cynical, and largely unseen audience. Whether one is delivering a highly anticipated keynote address, pitching a massive, high-stakes startup to a room full of heavily guarded investors, or meticulously crafting a highly engaging, deeply structured digital narrative designed to captivate and educate thousands of distant viewers, the fundamental, underlying principles of the straight line remain fiercely, stubbornly, and incredibly relevant. The modern creator of any narrative must meticulously, obsessively architect their presentation with the exact same ruthless, highly focused precision as the ancient boiler room script. They must violently and immediately capture the heavily fractured, incredibly fragile attention of their audience in the very first, critical moments, instantly establishing massive, undeniable authority and deep, resonant enthusiasm before the viewer rapidly clicks away into the endless, massive void of alternative content. The continuous, highly structured delivery of information must function exactly like the straight line, constantly, actively pulling the wandering, highly distracted mind of the audience back to the central, highly compelling core premise. Every single sentence, every single carefully selected visual or vocal inflection, must be meticulously designed to actively build massive, undeniable logical certainty in the value of the information being presented, while simultaneously, aggressively painting a vivid, highly emotional, deeply resonant picture of how this new knowledge will radically, permanently transform the viewer's current reality. The creator absolutely must anticipate the silent, highly skeptical objections constantly forming in the minds of their massive audience. Flawlessly, seamlessly weaving the highly effective, deeply psychological loops directly into the fabric of their narrative, consistently validating the viewer's hidden doubts before rapidly, masterfully dismantling them with unassailable, highly structured logic and deep, profound emotional resonance. This highly sophisticated, thoroughly modernized application clearly reveals the true, enduring, and deeply profound meaning buried deep within the chaotic, highly controversial history of the methodology. The ultimate, overarching purpose of mastering these incredibly powerful, deeply psychological techniques is not to become a highly skilled, deeply deceptive manipulator of the weak and vulnerable, but to become a tremendously effective, highly ethical, and incredibly powerful conduit for genuine, transformative value. The profound, inescapable truth is that the absolute best ideas, the most highly revolutionary, deeply helpful concepts, and the most massively beneficial, life-altering products in the world will completely, silently die in total, agonizing obscurity if they are not actively championed by someone who truly understands exactly how to effectively pierce the massive, dense, heavily fortified armor of human apathy. The ultimate responsibility of the master persuader is to firmly, ethically guide the deeply fearful, highly hesitant individual entirely past their own deeply ingrained, highly restrictive self-limitations. The core message the book ultimately, powerfully delivers to its readers is an incredibly challenging, deeply uncompromising call to extreme responsibility. It absolutely demands that you relentlessly, obsessively sharpen your ability to communicate, that you deeply master the highly complex, incredibly nuanced mechanics of tonality, script architecture, and emotional transference. But it sternly, violently demands that you anchor these terrifyingly powerful skills entirely to a foundation of absolute, unshakable, unquestionable ethical integrity. You must deeply, fundamentally believe that the specific vision you are actively selling, the deep, profound knowledge you are widely sharing, or the specific, highly calibrated solution you are offering will genuinely, undeniably, and measurably improve the life of the person absorbing your message. If you do not possess that absolute, pure, fundamentally unshakable conviction, the system becomes a toxic, highly destructive weapon, but when properly, ethically aligned, it becomes the single most powerful, incredibly transformative force in the entire landscape of human interaction. Mastering the art of influence without a moral compass makes you a monster. But mastering it with absolute integrity makes you an unstoppable force for profound change.